My name is Vernon Ashcroft, and I turned 78 this past February. I live alone now in a modest, two-bedroom ranch house in Denton, Texas. It's the same house I moved into with my late wife, Lorna, almost 46 years ago. We raised our son and daughter here, repainted the siding more times than I can count, patched the roof after hailstorms, and planted the oak tree in the front yard that now dwarfs the house itself. That tree was once a sapling in Lorna's hands, and now it's a towering monument to the time that slipped past us, heavy with years, like my own bones. Since Lorna passed away 5 years ago, I've done my best to keep the house clean and the garden trim. She would have wanted it that way. I make my own meals, do my laundry, and drive myself to the grocery store once a week. I still use the same old station wagon we bought when our first grandchild was born. It creaks and rattles, but it gets me there and back. My body's slower than it used to be, but my mind still works. At least I thought it did. Most mornings I wake up before sunrise. It's not insomnia exactly, just a kind of restlessness that's settled into me over the years. I boil water in the same battered kettle Lorna used, make myself black tea with a splash of milk, and sit in the armchair by the window, watching the streetlight flicker off and the world begin to stir. There's something comforting about that quiet, unclaimed hour before the neighborhood kids start yelling and the lawnmowers roar to life. I used to think of it as a peaceful kind of loneliness, but lately I've stopped pretending that peace and loneliness are the same thing. My son, Mason, lives in Oregon. We haven't spoken in almost 2 years. Our last phone call ended with an argument I can't quite remember the origin of. Something about politics or taxes or one of those subjects that turn sour faster than milk left on the counter. He sends me a Christmas card with a photo of his dogs every year, but no return address. My daughter, Erin, is closer, geographically at least. She and her husband, Brad, live in Plano, just an hour's drive away. They used to visit more often, especially right after Lorna died, but over time, the visits got shorter, and eventually, they stopped altogether. I don't think Erin is cruel. Not exactly. Just practical. Efficient. She always was. She manages some kind of real estate operations office now, overseeing other agents and closing high-value deals. She's sharp and well-dressed and never late. She's also the kind of person who measures care in logistics rather than emotion. After Lorna's funeral, Erin offered to help set things up for me. Automated pill organizers, home healthcare brochures, even an estate planner. At the time, I thought she was being helpful, but something about her tone left a chill in my chest, like I was just another task on her list, somewhere between finalizing escrow documents and booking dry cleaning. Brad, on the other hand, has never liked me. He's always been distant, never outright rude, but his politeness is the kind that stings, too polished to be genuine. He calls me Sir, which I find unsettling. He never liked it when I corrected the kids' table manners or told stories that went on too long. Lorna used to say, "Brad's just reserved," but I always knew he looked down on me. I worked most of my life as a civil engineer. I wasn't flashy or rich. I didn't own a boat or invest in stocks. I worked on roads and drainage systems, and I came home dirty. I was good at what I did, but Brad, he manages portfolios. Wears watches that cost more than my first car. I still get birthday cards from Erin, usually with a gift card inside, Home Depot or Walgreens or something impersonal. No messages, just a signature. She always writes, "Love, Erin and Brad." Never "Dad" or "We miss you." Just a formula, a placeholder. I keep them in a drawer, stacked neatly. Some part of me still hopes they'll mean something someday, even if I know better. What's worse than the silence is the sudden, jarring intrusion. About a month ago, Erin started calling more frequently. Not in a warm or nostalgic way. These were brief, overly cheerful check-ins like someone reading from a script. "Hi, Dad. Just seeing how you're doing. Are you eating well? Taking your meds? How's your sleep?" They weren't questions so much as a list. Every time I answered, I felt like I was being evaluated. Her voice was light, but her pauses were too calculated. At first, I thought she was just trying to reconnect. Maybe something had changed. Maybe she missed me. Then Brad called me directly. That was rare enough to make my ears ring. He sounded upbeat, in that salesman's way he has, and said he and Aaron were planning a short vacation and had a lovely little beach rental in South Padre Island. "Why don't you come with us?" he asked. "We thought it might be good for you to get away for a bit. Fresh air, family time." My first instinct was suspicion, but I swallowed it. I said yes. I wanted it to be real. I wanted to believe that they remembered I existed outside of birthday cards and gift balances. Still, something about the offer scratched at me like an itch I couldn't reach. I started keeping a notebook by the bed, writing down little things: what I ate, who I spoke to, whether I locked the back door. I told myself it was just to keep track, a little trick to stay organized. But if I'm honest, part of me was scared. I'd forgotten the name of my neighbor's dog last week. I'd lost my keys in the fridge 2 months ago. What if they were right to worry? I've seen it happen. Men like me, once independent, slowly lose themselves. It starts with confusion, then paranoia, and soon the children come around with papers to sign. I didn't want to believe it, but I'd heard stories. Neighbors, old friends. One man I used to play chess with at the library ended up in a care home against his will because his daughter claimed he forgot how to turn off the stove. He didn't forget. He just didn't hear the timer. I told myself Aaron and Brad weren't like that. They had good jobs, stable lives. They didn't need my money. And yet, lately, I'd noticed things missing. A few bank statements I could have sworn I left on the kitchen table. A prescription refill that never arrived. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more anxious I became. I started second-guessing everything I did. I found myself rereading the same article 3 times and checking the stove twice before bed. I told myself I was just being careful. When I mentioned the trip to my neighbor, Miss Helen, she raised one eyebrow and said, "Well, Vernon, just make sure you pack your scents along with your socks." I laughed, but her words lingered. The kind of warning people wrap in a joke. Now the trip is only 2 days away. I've packed light. Just some clothes, my pills, my phone charger. I added a portable voice recorder I bought years ago and never used. And last night, in a fit of insomnia, I pulled out the old nanny cam we used when our grandkids were toddlers. It still works. I tested it behind a row of books on the shelf. It recorded clearly. The camera's lens is tiny, nearly invisible. Maybe I won't need it. Maybe this trip will be the first step toward something better. Maybe I'll come back with stories instead of regrets. But just in case, I packed extra batteries. And as I zipped up the suitcase, I whispered to Lorna's photo on the mantel, "Wish me luck, darling. I think I might need it." The morning of our departure arrived with an unsettling quiet. I had barely slept, tossing between sheets that suddenly felt too heavy, my thoughts moving in anxious circles. I got up at 5, showered, dressed, and made myself a breakfast I could barely touch. The eggs were rubbery, the toast too dry, or maybe it was just me. I double-checked my suitcase, socks, undershirts, slacks, medication, the little voice recorder tucked into the lining of my toiletry bag, and the nanny cam, carefully hidden inside a hollowed-out book I'd marked as retirement planning. I slipped a notepad into the side pocket, just in case. At precisely 7:45, I heard the sharp crunch of tires on gravel. I opened the curtains to see Brad's sleek black SUV idling in my driveway. He didn't get out, of course. He never did. Erin stepped out of the passenger side wearing a beige windbreaker over tailored jeans, her hair pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail. She moved briskly, her heels tapping on the walk as she approached my front door. "Good morning, Dad," she said with a smile too bright for this hour. "Ready for some sunshine?" I nodded, lifting my bag. She offered to take it, but didn't wait for my answer. already halfway back to the car with it by the time I locked the door behind me. Brad didn't say a word as I climbed into the back seat. He gave a brief nod to the rearview mirror, a gesture so devoid of warmth it felt mechanical. Erin adjusted the air conditioning and turned around in her seat with a practiced grin. "Comfortable? Need anything before we go? Bathroom? Water?" "No, I'm good," I said, settling in. The leather seats were cool and smelled faintly of some industrial cleaning product. The car pulled out before I even fastened my seatbelt. We drove in silence for almost half an hour. Erin scrolled through her phone, occasionally glancing over at Brad's screen and murmuring something I couldn't hear. They didn't include me in their conversation. I sat with my hands folded on my lap, staring at the passing fields, feeling like cargo rather than company. At one point, I asked if we'd be stopping for breakfast. Erin gave a tight smile and said, "We brought snacks." She handed me a small plastic bag containing a granola bar and an apple. 3 hours into the drive, we stopped for gas at a convenience store on the outskirts of Waco. I used the restroom and, while washing my hands, caught my own reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, older than I remembered. There was a hollowness around my eyes I hadn't seen before. I took a deep breath, splashed water on my face, and told myself to stop being dramatic. Back in the car, Brad asked, "You remember where we're headed, right?" His voice was light, but his eyes were calculating. "South Padre Island," I said, meeting his gaze. "You mentioned the beach house." He smiled faintly. "That's right, just making sure." Erin turned slightly in her seat. "We just want to be sure you're feeling good, Dad. No confusion, no headaches?" I frowned. "I'm fine. Why would I be confused?" She waved it off. "Just being careful. You know how it is at your age. Travel can be disorienting." I said nothing. My fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. We arrived at the beach house late in the afternoon. It was bigger than I expected. 3 stories tall, painted seafoam green with white trim, perched just a few hundred yards from the water. Erin led the way, punching in a code on the smart lock. Inside, the air smelled of lemon and fresh paint. Everything gleamed: granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, wide windows facing the ocean. My room was on the first floor, tucked in the back, window facing a wall. A narrow bed, a small dresser, and a television mounted too high on the wall. No personal touches, no photos. It felt sterile. Erin showed me how to use the smart thermostat, which required an app on my phone, and reminded me, twice, not to adjust the settings manually. Dinner that evening was takeout. Sushi. Erin claimed it was light and healthy. I tried to remember the last time I ate raw fish. I wasn't sure I ever had. When I reached for soy sauce, she quickly said, "Careful with that, Dad. Your sodium." "I don't have blood pressure issues," I replied. She raised her eyebrows. "Are you sure? Didn't your doctor say something at your last appointment?" I stared at her. "You weren't there." "I talked to the nurse after," she said casually and turned to open a bottle of sparkling water. "Anyway, it's better to be cautious." That night, after everyone went to their rooms, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the blank television screen. Something was off. Not just the coldness of the house, not just Brad's silence or Erin's forced cheer, it was the way they kept watching me, tracking my responses, steering conversations like handlers. I turned off the lights, got into bed, and lay there for hours with my eyes open, listening to the occasional creak of footsteps upstairs, the low hum of the conversation behind a closed door. The next morning, Erin knocked and entered before I could answer. "Time for your meds," she said, holding out a pill organizer. I looked at it. The compartments were labeled morning and night. I picked up one of the pills and turned it in my hand. "What is this?" She hesitated just for a moment. "Vitamin D. Doctor recommended it, and the blue one's a mild mood stabilizer. You said you've been having trouble sleeping." "I never said that." "Well, you did mention restlessness." "I didn't ask for pills." "They're mild, Dad. Just take them." "I'd like to speak to my doctor myself," I said. Erin's expression didn't change. "We'll schedule something next week. Let's just try these for now." She set the organizer on my nightstand and left. I didn't take the pills. I hid them under a tissue in the wastebasket and recorded the entire exchange with my voice recorder. I wasn't sure yet what I was collecting, but my instincts told me to start. Later that day, Brad announced that a social worker would be stopping by. "Just a wellness check," he said. "Totally routine. She does these for people over 70. I blinked. "Why would I need a wellness check?" "Because you're living alone," Erin interjected. "It's standard. They check to make sure you're okay, not being neglected, that kind of thing." "But I'm not being neglected." "Of course not," she said, smiling. "It's just protocol." The woman arrived at 2 p.m. She was polite, mid-30s, wore a blazer and a lanyard. She asked me basic questions: my birth date, where I was, who the president was. I answered easily. Then she asked if I ever forgot appointments, got lost while driving, left appliances on. I said no, but she kept glancing at her clipboard like she'd already marked yes. After she left, I overheard Erin and Brad speaking in hushed voices upstairs. I crept to the hallway and caught fragments through the vent. Early indicators. Can file by next month if we get enough documentation. Power of attorney. We'll have to talk to the bank. That night, I installed the nanny cam. I placed it on the shelf in my room, perfectly angled to capture the bed, the nightstand, and the door. The light on the device was tiny and didn't glow. It blended perfectly with the other electronics. I tested it using my phone as a receiver. Clear picture. Crisp audio. I left it running and lay down, staring at the ceiling. I felt something I hadn't felt in decades, a creeping fear that I was no longer safe in my own family. That my daughter, the baby I once rocked to sleep in a yellow blanket, was scheming against me. I thought of Lorna, how furious she would have been to see her family like this, and I thought of my notebook, the pages filling with dates, phrases, patterns. Something was happening. I didn't know the whole picture yet, but I would, and I would be ready. The next few days unfolded with an unnerving regularity, each one stitched together with the same forced politeness, the same quiet manipulations, the same underlying current of control masked as concern. I began to notice a pattern, as if the entire trip had been choreographed in advance and I was just a reluctant actor stumbling through his marks. Erin woke me every morning around 7:30, her knock soft but uninvited, stepping in with a brightness in her voice that felt artificial and over-rehearsed. She brought in the pill organizer again and watched me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes until I pretended to take them. I learned quickly to slip them beneath my tongue, spit them into a tissue, and flush them down the toilet when no one was looking. Brad didn't engage much. He spent most of his time on his laptop, taking calls with headphones on, pacing the balcony and muttering about investments, though I never saw any emails or documents open on his screen. When he did speak to me, it was in clipped, polite sentences. "You all right, sir?" Or, "Need anything?" Always formal, always detached. One afternoon, while Erin was at the grocery store and Brad claimed to be taking a nap upstairs, I took the opportunity to test the camera footage. Using the encrypted connection I'd set up between my phone and the nanny cam, I pulled up the last 48 hours of recordings. I watched myself sleeping, tossing, and turning. At around 2 a.m. on the previous night, the door to my room opened slowly. Erin stepped inside, barefoot, moving quietly. She approached the nightstand, lifted the pill organizer, checked it, and then opened the drawer. She rummaged briefly, then turned to the closet, opening the door. She scanned the hanging shirts, then reached to the shelf above and pulled down the shoebox where I'd stashed some of my documents. My will, a copy of my birth certificate, a folder marked Accounts. I hadn't realized until that moment that she knew exactly where I kept it. She flipped through the papers, took a photo with her phone of something inside, then carefully placed it all back and left the room. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the recording. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. What I felt was a deep, bone-set dread. Something was happening, something calculated, and they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. They just assumed I wouldn't notice, or worse, that I wouldn't remember. The following morning, the breakfast conversation turned unexpectedly cruel. I had made a comment about a local diner I passed on a walk, and Aaron laughed gently. "You said that yesterday, Dad." I blinked. "I don't think so." "You did. You said it yesterday and the day before. You're repeating yourself a lot lately." Brad didn't look up from his phone. "Maybe it's time to schedule that assessment, just to be safe." "What assessment?" I asked. Erin sipped her coffee. "We've been talking to Dr. Randall. He suggested a cognitive evaluation. It's very routine. A lot of people your age do it." "I never agreed to that." She smiled thinly. "You didn't have to. We're just concerned. You've been forgetting things." I stared at them both. "You mean you're concerned that I'm still aware of what's going on?" Erin's smile faltered just for a moment. "That's not fair, Dad. We're trying to help you." I stood up from the table. "I don't need your help. I need you to leave my things alone." Brad finally looked up. "You don't know what you need." That stopped me. There was no kindness in his tone, no softness, just a certainty, cold and hard like a closed door. I left the kitchen without another word, walked out onto the deck and stared out at the waves. The tide was coming in. The sky was overcast. I could smell the salt, thick in the air like memory. I didn't want to cry, but my eyes stung. I remembered when Erin was little, when I used to carry her on my shoulders at the beach, her hands tangled in my hair, her giggles like music. Now, I didn't recognize her voice anymore. It had a sharpness, a purpose I couldn't trace to anything loving. That evening, they brought in another visitor. This time, it was a man named Howard, introduced as a cognitive behavioral specialist. He wore a beige sweater and wire-rimmed glasses, smiled too widely, and shook my hand with both of his. "I've worked with dozens of families in similar situations," he said warmly. "Just here to ask a few questions, totally informal." I nodded cautiously and sat across from him in the living room. Erin hovered near the doorway, arms crossed. Howard began gently. "Can you tell me today's date?" "August 10th. And the year?" 2025. "Great. Can you remember 3 words? Apple, table, penny?" I repeated them. He asked a few more questions. "Count backwards from 100 by 7s. Name the current president. Draw a clock." I answered every one without hesitation. After 10 minutes, he leaned back, scratching notes into a legal pad. "Very good." "Very sharp," Aaron stepped in. "But he forgets things all the time. He left the stove on last week." "I didn't," I snapped. She continued as if I hadn't spoken. "He also lost his bank card, forgot our address, and called me by the wrong name yesterday." "I didn't." Howard didn't respond. He just nodded and continued writing. I knew then that whatever this was, it wasn't a fair evaluation. It was a performance, and I wasn't the audience. I was the evidence. I wanted to shout, to demand justice, but I also knew better. I sat there quietly, smiled when Howard left, and said nothing when Aaron closed the door behind him. But as soon as they went upstairs, I reviewed the footage. The camera caught everything. The test, the conversation, Aaron's lies. I clipped the video and saved it to 3 different USB drives. Then I wrote down everything, every question, every answer, every word they said. I dated the page. I underlined the word lies 3 times in red. 2 nights later, I woke up at 3 a.m. to hushed voices outside my door. I crept out of bed and pressed my ear to the wood. "It's too soon," Brad was saying. He's still too sharp. He's slipping, Aaron whispered. It's just stress. Once we file for temporary guardianship, the court will require a formal evaluation. By then, we'll have enough. We can't wait, Brad hissed. I talked to the bank yesterday. We need access now. I pulled back from the door, my heart pounding. My hand was trembling, but not with age, with rage. The next morning, I told them I wanted to cut the trip short. Brad raised an eyebrow. We still have 4 days. I'm not feeling well, I said. I want to go home. Aaron glanced at Brad, then smiled too widely. Of course, Dad. But you don't need to rush. Just rest today. We'll talk about travel tomorrow. That afternoon, they went out, supposedly to get groceries. I took the opportunity to pack my things. I deleted the Nanny Cam app from my phone, stashed the camera in my suitcase, and put the 3 USB drives in separate bags. One in my shoe, one in my toiletry kit, and one inside a vitamin bottle. I grabbed my ID, my phone, and the hidden cash I had kept in the lining of my suitcase, just in case. When they returned, I pretended to be asleep. The next morning, before sunrise, I slipped out. I walked half a mile to the nearest bus stop and took the local line to the city center. I found a hotel and paid cash for a night's stay. From there, I called my lawyer, Richard Feller, and told him I had something urgent. He didn't ask questions, just said to come in the next day. I sat in that hotel room, curtains closed, door locked, USB drives spread on the bed like evidence in a trial. I watched the footage again. Pausing at each moment, Aaron looked at me like I wasn't her father, but an obstacle. I remembered the first time she said, "Daddy," after scraping her knee on the playground. I remembered carrying her to bed when she fell asleep on the couch. I remembered holding her hand in the hospital when she gave birth to her son. I stared at the screen now, at the woman calling me confused and fragile, and I finally let myself feel the grief. The morning I walked into Richard Feller's office, the humidity of the coastal air still clinging to my clothes, I felt older than I ever had. Not from the miles I had traveled or the sleepless nights stacked behind my eyes, but from the weight of knowing something I never wanted to believe. That my own child had looked at me not as a person to protect, but as a possession to control. Richard had been my lawyer for over 20 years. He handled our wills when Lorna was alive, helped with property matters, and once intervened when a contractor tried to scam me on a kitchen remodel. He wasn't a man prone to sentiment, which made him trustworthy. When he saw me walk in without an appointment, suitcase in hand, he didn't smile or joke. He simply nodded toward his office and closed the door behind us. I told him everything. The conversations, the staged evaluations, the pills, the late-night whispering. I showed him the footage on one of the USB drives. He watched with furrowed brows, silent until the very end. When it was over, he leaned back in his chair and took a long breath. "This isn't just family drama," he said quietly. "This is premeditated. If what you're saying is true, they may already be working to file for guardianship behind your back." I nodded. They want control of my finances, my home, everything. He opened a drawer and pulled out a notepad. "We need to move quickly. First, we'll draft a revocation of any medical or financial powers of attorney you may have previously assigned to your daughter. Did you ever sign anything giving her authority?" "I don't remember," I said honestly. "There may have been something after Lorna died, but I trusted her then." Richard nodded grimly. "We'll revoke it either way. Then we'll file a formal statement of mental competency. I'll have you evaluated by a neutral specialist, someone the court will trust. Once we establish that you're of sound mind, we can preempt any guardianship petition they try to file." "What if they already filed?" "Then we'll challenge it with the footage. But the sooner we act, the better." We worked through the day, making phone calls, drafting documents, scanning my notes, duplicating the video files again and submitting them to Richard's secure case system. I was evaluated the very next morning by a doctor Richard had worked with in previous cases, a soft-spoken neurologist named Dr. Leyland, who asked thoughtful questions and treated me like a person, not a patient. I passed the evaluation easily. He even complimented my memory, saying most men my age struggled far more with dates and names than I did. It was in that sterile white room, under the flickering light of an outdated ceiling panel, that the full weight of what I'd escaped began to settle in. They had been planning this for months, maybe longer. I wondered if Erin had first considered it when I forgot her anniversary last year, or when I asked her twice in 1 week whether Brad was still working at the same firm. Perhaps I had given them all the ammunition they needed without realizing it. But it wasn't just forgetfulness they were counting on. It was my silence. My unwillingness to believe that the people I loved could turn me into a liability. When the evaluation was complete, Richard submitted the results to the county clerk's office along with a formal declaration of legal competence. That filing would show up in court records if Erin or Brad tried to move forward with a petition. He also sent certified letters to both of them stating that I had retained counsel and that all legal communication should go through his office. I imagined their surprise when those envelopes arrived. I imagined the moment Erin opened hers and realized I had seen through everything. The following days moved slowly. I returned to my house in Denton, which felt smaller than I remembered and strangely untouched, like a museum dedicated to someone who had disappeared. Dust on the table, a stack of newspapers by the door, the faint smell of stale coffee. I cleaned what I could. I aired out the guest room. I turned on the porch light each evening, not because I expected anyone, but because Lorna always said a dark house invited sadness. I didn't want to feel like a ghost in my own home. One morning, the phone rang. Not the cell, the old landline I kept out of habit. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Erin's voice came through tight and brittle. "Dad, where are you?" "At home." There was a long silence. Then, "Why didn't you say anything? You just disappeared. We thought something happened." "You mean you were afraid something didn't happen?" Her breath caught. "That's not fair. I think it's the first fair thing I've said in a while." Another pause. Then her voice softened like she was slipping back into the version of herself that had once sat on my lap with scraped knees and cotton candy. "I was worried about you." "No," I said quietly. "You were worried you'd run out of time." The line went dead not long after. I didn't hear from her again for weeks. Then came the letter. Thick envelope, legal formatting. A petition for emergency guardianship filed by Brad and Erin Hollander, citing escalating memory issues, inability to manage finances, and episodes of confusion and paranoia. They even included a signed statement from Howard, the so-called cognitive specialist, and a notarized list of incidents, most of which were pure fiction. There were references to things I'd never done. Wandering at night, misplacing medication, calling Erin by the wrong name. All meticulously presented in a clinical tone designed to disguise betrayal as concern. But we were ready. Richard had already filed our counterclaim and submitted the video evidence and evaluation results. When the court date was set, he told me I didn't need to appear in person unless I wanted to. I said I did. I wanted them to see me, standing, speaking, remembering everything. The day of the hearing arrived draped in an unforgiving grayness, a thin drizzle blurring the edges of buildings and car windows like the world itself wasn't sure it wanted to be seen clearly. I arrived at the courthouse early, an hour before the scheduled session, wearing the suit I'd had tailored 25 years ago for Mason's wedding. It fit looser now, my frame having surrendered much of its muscle to time, but it still held its shape, still reminded me of who I was and had been. Richard met me at the main entrance, umbrella in one hand, briefcase in the other, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I've been ready since the night they slipped pills into my orange juice." We didn't speak again until we entered the courtroom, a bland, echo-prone chamber with dull beige carpeting and an American flag drooping near the judge's bench. The hearing was closed to the public, given its nature, but that didn't lessen the weight of the room. Aaron and Brad sat at the opposite table, flanked by a young, overconfident attorney with a pocket square too large for his jacket. Aaron looked thinner than usual, her face pale and composed in a way that told me she had rehearsed this moment a dozen times. Brad didn't look at me. He sat staring straight ahead, jaw clenched, foot twitching beneath the table. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s named Marla Kinley, entered briskly and took her seat. The bailiff called for silence, and the proceedings began. Their lawyer spoke first, laying out their concerns with the kind of practice solemnity that manages to sound both deferential and damning. "Mr. Ashcroft," he said, "has exhibited signs of progressive memory decline, impaired judgment, and delusional thinking. My clients, his daughter and son-in-law, have attempted to care for him with compassion and discretion, but recent events have forced their hand. They fear for his safety and, more importantly, for the security of his financial affairs. They are seeking temporary guardianship with the intention of long-term protection." He then called Erin to the stand. She swore in, straightened her back, and began what could only be described as a performance, full of measured pauses, tearful inflections, and occasional looks toward me that blended concern with heartbreak. She described the supposed incidents, forgetting names, leaving the stove on, wandering barefoot outside in the middle of the night, claiming people were watching him. She even mentioned violent outbursts, though she could provide no examples. At one point, she began crying, dabbing her eyes delicately with a tissue. "I love my father," she said, voice cracking just enough to sound authentic. "This isn't easy, but I can't watch him deteriorate without doing something. He raised me. I owe him safety, even if he doesn't want it." Brad followed. His testimony was colder, more businesslike. He talked about finances, about erratic withdrawals, about missing paperwork and concerns about fraud. He suggested that I had fallen prey to online scams and was becoming increasingly paranoid. He said I accused them of stealing without any evidence. The judge listened silently, jotting the occasional note. Then Richard rose and quietly asked the court to play an exhibit for consideration. The bailiff inserted the USB into the courtroom monitor system. The footage filled the screen. Aaron entering my room in the middle of the night, rummaging through my papers, taking photos, the exchange with the faux cognitive specialist, who never once showed credentials, the whispered conversation in the hallway about guardianship and bank access. The room was silent, save for the voices on the video. Aaron went pale. Brad's face darkened with recognition. When the screen went black again, Richard calmly introduced the neurological evaluation, the written declaration from the doctor, and the timeline of recorded notes I'd been keeping since before the trip. Then he turned to me and nodded. I stood and made my way to the witness box. My knees ached, but I didn't show it. I raised my hand, took the oath, and sat down. My name is Vernon Ashcroft. I may be 78 years old, but I am not senile, nor am I confused. What I am is betrayed by my daughter and her husband, who, under the guise of concern, attempted to strip me of my rights and my independence. I have never endangered myself. I have never mismanaged my finances, and I have never, ever asked to be rescued. I looked directly at Aaron. What I did ask for, years ago, was a place at the table, a phone call, a visit, a shred of what I used to have with my family. Instead, I became an obstacle, an inconvenient burden. So they planned to get rid of the burden. But I wasn't ready to go, and I certainly wasn't ready to be erased. I paused, my voice steady, though the room felt like it was leaning toward me. I am asking this court not only to deny this petition, but to understand that age alone does not equal incompetence. Memory lapses are not dementia. Anger is not delusion. And suspicion, especially when earned, is not paranoia. Judge Kinley thanked me, then recessed for deliberation. It took 23 minutes. When she returned, she didn't hesitate. The petition for guardianship is denied. The evidence presented indicates not only full mental capacity, but active deception on the part of the petitioners. This court finds that the attempt to establish guardianship was not made in good faith. Furthermore, I will refer this case for possible investigation into elder exploitation. Aaron gasped. Brad finally looked at me, and his face was pure hate. Back outside, Richard shook my hand. "You won," he said. "I didn't win," I replied. "I survived." But something in me had shifted. That night, alone in my house, I made tea and stared at Lorna's photograph. I could hear her voice, could almost feel her hand on my shoulder. I didn't cry. There wasn't any sorrow left. Only the quiet aftermath of a storm. In the following weeks, I took steps. I changed my banking institutions. I moved my savings into protected accounts. I rewrote my will, leaving clear instructions for what would happen after I was gone. None of it involving Aaron or Brad. I sold the house and purchased a small apartment in a retirement community 2 counties away, under a different name. I left no forwarding address. Only Richard knew how to reach me. A month later, I received a certified letter from Aaron's attorney, requesting a reconciliation conversation. I never opened it. I burned it in the sink, watching the corners curl into ash. I had nothing left to say. The fall air in Denton is different from the heat-drenched skies of late summer. It's dry and quiet, filled with that faint scent of fallen leaves and change. Not the chaotic, dramatic kind, but the slow, inevitable shifting that happens whether you're ready for it or not. In my new apartment, smaller and simpler than the home Lorna and I built together, I found myself surrounded by unfamiliar stillness. No ticking grandfather clock, no creaking porch swing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the low murmur of the radio I kept on most days, tuned to classical. Not for any deep love of the music, but for the steadiness of it, the structure, the predictability. I hadn't spoken to Aaron since the hearing. After the judge's ruling, after the footage, after the evaluation reports, after her face crumbled in real time as her plan unraveled in front of the court, she hadn't tried to call again. I thought maybe that was the end. But in families like mine, things don't always end with silence. Sometimes they end with one last, desperate attempt to regain the story. It was mid-October when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one knew where I lived now except Richard, the building manager, and the utilities. I moved cautiously, peeking through the peephole, and there she was. Erin. No makeup, no blazer, no curated calm. Just a beige sweater, slightly wrinkled, and a tote bag clutched against her side like a shield. She stood without moving, like she knew I was watching and refused to beg. I opened the door slowly, saying nothing. "Hi, Dad." I let the silence stretch a little too long before I replied. "How did you find me?" "I called Richard. He told me only after I said I wasn't here to fight." "That's not his call to make." "I know," she said softly. "But I'm glad he did." I didn't step aside. "What do you want?" "To talk." She looked older than she had a month ago. Not in a cosmetic sense, but in the way people look when their arrogance has been peeled back and replaced with something less confident. Her eyes were tired, the skin under them slightly purple. She had always taken pride in appearing composed, in being the most prepared person in any room. She didn't look prepared now. After a long pause, I stepped back and opened the door wider. We sat at the small dining table by the window. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds in slanted stripes, painting us in alternating shadow and warmth. I didn't offer her tea. She didn't ask. "I know you don't owe me anything," she began. "I know you probably hate me." I shook my head slowly. "I don't hate you. I just don't believe in you anymore." She nodded, as if she'd rehearsed that possibility and had no rebuttal. "I came to say that I'm sorry. And not just in that surface way. People apologize when they're caught. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why I did what I did. That sounds like the beginning of a justification. It's not. Or maybe it is. I don't know anymore. All I can tell you is that I panicked. Brad lost a lot of money last year. Investments, real estate ventures. We weren't in as good of a place as we made it seem. And I looked at you, sitting alone in that house, watching the same TV shows, reading the same paper, and I thought, what's the difference? He doesn't use the money. He barely spends. He lives like he's already halfway gone. I felt that one like a cold slap. I didn't respond. I started telling myself it would be better for you, she continued, that we'd manage your affairs responsibly, that we'd protect you from being taken advantage of. But the truth is, we were the ones taking advantage. I don't know when that switch happened in my head, but it did. I convinced myself that it was okay. And now? Now I live in a house I can't afford, with a man I barely recognize, and a father who won't speak to me. And I realize I've built a life on illusions. That family can be calculated. That love is some kind of transaction. She looked down at her hands, as if the lines in her palms could give her better answers than I could. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said finally. "I just wanted you to hear it from me." We sat in silence again. The radiator clicked once, the sound sharp in the otherwise still apartment. "You lied to doctors," I said. "You made up symptoms. You tried to steal my life." She flinched but didn't argue. "You sat in court and cried on command, and then turned around and looked surprised when it didn't work. Do you know how many nights I lay awake wondering if I was losing my mind? Not because of age, but because my own daughter treated me like a patient." "I know." "No, you don't," I said, "because if you did, you wouldn't have come here. You'd have left me alone to build whatever peace I have left." She swallowed hard. "You're right. And yet you came anyway." "Because I still wanted to try." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The bitterness in my mouth wasn't as sharp as it had been. It was just residue now, like the aftertaste of old grief. "You know what the worst part is?" I asked. She looked up. "You took away my certainty. For weeks I didn't trust my own memories, my own thoughts. You took the one thing that aging leaves you, the dignity of your own mind, and you made me question if it was even mine anymore." "I'm sorry." "I know." She stood, slowly, folding her tote bag under her arm. "I won't come again." "Unless you want me to." I nodded once, not in invitation, but acknowledgement. At the door, she turned back. Mom would have hated me for this. I looked out the window, the trees beginning to redden and curl. "No," I said quietly. "She would have been heartbroken." And then she was gone. That night, I walked the hallway of my apartment complex, nodding to the few neighbors I'd come to know. A man named Claude, with a miniature schnauzer. A woman named Beverly who played bingo on Tuesdays. I didn't tell them anything about my visitor. I didn't tell them anything at all. I returned to my apartment, made myself a grilled cheese sandwich, and watched the news without hearing a word of it. Later, I sat down and wrote a letter, not to Aaron, but to Hazel and Adam, my grandchildren. I told them a version of the story, gentler and more metaphorical. I told them about boundaries and the difference between love and possession. I didn't blame their mother directly, but I made it clear that silence had consequences. I left it unsigned, dated, and stored in a box with the rest of my just-in-case documents. Some stories don't end with a bang or a confession. They end with a pause, a turning away, and the quiet reclaiming of something lost. Winter came early that year, as if the sky itself was trying to hush the world into stillness. The first frost glazed the window panes of my apartment in late November, and the courtyard trees dropped their leaves all at once like they were too tired to hold on. Inside, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I needed. I started every morning with a slow walk around the complex, nodding to familiar faces. I signed up for a book club. Didn't say much, but listened. I began to cook again, real food, the kind that takes more than one pot. Sometimes I caught myself humming while peeling apples or seasoning a roast. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It was something quieter, steadier, a reclaiming. I didn't speak to Erin again. Her number remained in my phone, not blocked, but untouched. A relic, like an old house key that doesn't fit any lock anymore. There were moments when I wanted to call her, on Christmas Eve when the lights flickered on outside my window, or when a neighbor's grandchild ran past my door shouting, "Grandpa!" But I didn't. Because I understood something now that I hadn't understood before. Forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's just a closing of the book, a choice not to reread the same chapter. I mailed the letter to Hazel and Adam in mid-December. No return address, no sender name, just a clean envelope with their names written in my old engineer's penmanship. Neat, careful, exact. I don't know if they read it. I don't know what they were told about what happened, but I wanted them to have some truth in their hands, even if it came wrapped in metaphor. I saw Brad on the news once, not for anything scandalous, just a photo in the background of a local business conference. He looked unchanged, slick hair, tight jaw, handshake midair. I felt nothing, not anger, not fear. Just a mild detachment, the way you might feel seeing a photo of someone you sat behind in high school. I kept the nanny cam, though. It sits in my nightstand drawer, next to my passport and a list of emergency contacts. Not because I expect to use it again, but because its presence reminds me of something I never want to forget. That passivity can be a slow death. That trust, once weaponized, doesn't grow back in the same way. I goes to the library every Thursday now. There's a chess club there, mostly old men like me with crooked fingers and slow voices. We don't talk much while we play, but I find a strange peace in the soft clack of wood against wood, the long pauses, the occasional chuckle at an unexpected move. Last week, a man named Walter leaned in and said, "You're not from around here, are you?" I just smiled. "Not anymore," I replied. Some people think isolation is the enemy of old age, that we all need bustling homes full of laughter and grandchildren and casseroles. But I've come to believe something else. Isolation isn't the danger. The danger is proximity without care. Familiar voices that speak in manipulation. Family dinners served with expectation instead of love. I would rather eat soup alone in silence than carve turkey at a table where I'm being erased with every bite. There are moments I still miss Erin. Not the woman she is now, but the child she once was. The girl who used to hand me her drawings and ask if I could hang them in my office. The teenager who snuck me chocolate when Lorna banned sweets after my cholesterol test. That version of her lives in me still, but as a memory, not a hope. And I think that's how healing works sometimes. Not by rebuilding the bridge, but by learning how to live on your side of the river. I'm not bitter. I'm not angry. I'm something more complicated than that. A kind of watchful peace. A quiet dignity reclaimed after a storm that was meant to break me, but instead revealed who I still was beneath the wear of years and silence. I don't fear losing my mind anymore, because I held on to it when it mattered most. When the people closest to me tried to convince me I'd already lost it. Now, each evening, I sit by the window with a cup of tea and a notebook. Sometimes I write, sometimes I don't. But the light is always on. And if someone were to pass by and look up, they'd see that I'm still here, still thinking, still whole, still me.